Here we go. Breaking news. Woj bomb. I knew something was happening.
Sorry to interrupt you, Perk, but we have a trade coming in right now from our Adrian Wojnarowski.
You joking or you for real?
For real.
For real. He for real? That's what's being reported.
There's nothing quite like a big NBA trade, especially the ones that occur in the middle of the season. On a random Tuesday afternoon, just a few hours before games tip off, one move can single-handedly turn around a franchise and launch them into contention, or it could be a sign of them punting and getting ready to rebuild. Each year, there seems to be at least one major in-season transaction that shakes up the entire dynamic of the league. And with the trade deadline being less than a month away, I thought it'd be fun to look back and review the biggest trade from each of the last 5 seasons and see how the moves ended up panning out for each team. Starting with last year, the James Harden-Ben Simmons swap saw 2 teams trying to do damage control with the disgruntled superstars that they were dealing with. For Brooklyn, Harden was frustrated with the direction of the team due to him having to carry a heavy burden in the wake of Kevin Durant's injury and Kyrie Irving only being available part-time. Since he was in a contract year, he basically forced his hand with Brooklyn by telling them he wasn't going to re-sign in the offseason. Not wanting to lose him for nothing, the Nets took the best assets that they could get for him, and that was a package that featured Ben Simmons, Andre Drummond, and Seth Curry. For Brooklyn, this is about as good as they could have done given the situation that they were in. Like I mentioned before, they were at the risk of losing Harden for nothing after all they gave up for him just a year prior. And this whole thing happened in the span of just a couple weeks. So it's not like they had the luxury of time to try and figure out a perfect deal. So even though I'm sure they would have rather kept the beard, getting back Ben Simmons to pretty much just defend and play make for them makes their roster a bit more well-rounded and is as good as they could have done in the predicament that they were in. For Philly, this was an absolutely great move. There were packages floating around for months that many people thought Daryl Morey was an idiot not to accept. He held out until pretty much the last minute and got what seems to be a perfect running mate for Joel Embiid. Even though Harden isn't the same player he used to be, he's still putting up all-star numbers and is a much better second option compared to Ben Simmons. And when you take into account that Simmons was just dead weight on the Sixers roster because he was holding out, this was truly a home run move. The biggest trade of 2021 was once again centered around James Harden. A few weeks into the season, a massive 4-team deal saw the Nets send Jarrett Allen, Taurean Prince to Cleveland, Harris LeVert to Indiana, and 3 first-round picks as well as 4 pick swaps to the Rockets in exchange for James Harden. Victor Oladipo was also moved to Houston, and Cleveland sent a first-round pick over as well. While of course it's hard to justify Brooklyn making this trade in hindsight because of what happened the next year, I still think it was a great move that they had to make. Any 2 of Kyrie, KD, and Harden suiting up looked good enough for this team to go and probably win the finals, but it took some historically bad injury luck for them to just barely lose to Milwaukee in the second round. As for Houston, they got a great package in return for letting go of the face of their franchise. Given that Harden ended up getting hurt a few months into his Nets tenure, which effectively ended his prime as we knew it, the Rockets got rid of him when his stock was at his absolute highest. Sure, Victor Oladipo didn't quite work out for them, but getting a total of 7 draft picks from Brooklyn is an absolutely massive haul for one player. We'll of course have to wait and see what those picks turn into before we can fully assess how this deal works out for them, but as of now it's looking pretty good. As for Cleveland, them getting Jarrett Allen was one of the most forgotten aspects of this trade. Prior to his arrival on the Cavs, the Nets were starting DeAndre Jordan over him, as they clearly didn't see the value that he could bring to the table as an elite rim protector. Brooklyn really had no problem sending him off and then acquiring James Harden, but given their roster construction now with their frontcourt being pretty hollow, I'm sure they wish that they could have found a way to keep him around. While Nick Claxton is a serviceable big for them nowadays, he is nowhere near the level of Jarrett Allen. And all Cleveland had to do was send over a first-round pick that they got from Milwaukee to set up the incredible pairing of Evan Mobley and Jarrett Allen as the anchors of their defense today, which is an absolute steal looking back. While we couldn't see the immediate impact of any in-season trades this year because of what happened in March of 2020, the Andrew Wiggins-D'Angelo Russell swap would go on to have long-term effects for both the Warriors and the Timberwolves. It's hard to believe that it was only 3 years ago, but when Kevin Durant announced that he was going to leave the Warriors for the Nets, he worked with Golden State to set up a sign and trade so they didn't lose him for nothing. Even though the fit next to Steph was interesting at best, the Dubs felt that getting a solid asset in D'Angelo Russell, who just had his best season, will work out one way or another, and they were 100% right. The duo's tenure got off to a rocky start as Stephen Curry broke his hand just 4 games into the season, leaving D'Lo out there by himself with mostly G League level talent. During the time Curry was out, Russell put up a solid 23 points per game to keep his stock nice and high. And despite them not playing in any games together, everybody knew once Klay Thompson came back from injury, it didn't make much sense rolling out a lineup that featured the Splash Brothers and Russell. So they went and took a gamble on Andrew Wiggins, who was seen as nothing more than a talented but unmotivated player who seemed like he was going to end up being a bust. Since it was clear that the duo of Karl Anthony Towns and Wiggins was going nowhere, Minnesota wanted to shake things up and pair D'Lo and Cat to be the point guard and center of the future that would ultimately get them back to the playoffs. But once Wiggins arrived in Golden State, He became an excellent 3-and-D wing who ended up being the second best player on the Warriors championship team last season. He went from being someone who gave little to no effort on the court to a workhorse who guards the opposing team's best player and fits whatever role the offense needs. It looks like Minnesota got fleeced in this deal because D'Lo hasn't been great considering his massive contract, but Andrew Wiggins would not have developed into this type of player if he stayed in Minnesota. He needed a change of scenery, as it was clear his time in Minnesota had run its course. Especially considering the fact that they drafted Anthony Edwards the following season, there really wouldn't have been any room for him on this roster anyways. While Russell is by no means a bad point guard, he hasn't gotten back to that all-star form he used to be in Brooklyn, and his production definitely hasn't matched how much he's being paid. But then again, there also aren't really any point guards on the market at the time that could be seen as a true upgrade from him, so we'll have to wait and see if the Timberwolves bring him back when his contract expires this season. 2019 featured another swing and a miss from Minnesota, as they blew up their first competent team in over a decade. After trading for Jimmy Butler in the summer of 2017, he grew frustrated with Minnesota after not feeling valued by them despite leading the team to their only playoff berth in the last 14 seasons. When he let them know he had no intention of re-signing once he entered free agency, the Sixers pounced on the opportunity and traded for Butler in exchange for Robert Covington, Dario Saric, and a second-round pick. This deal ended up not working out for either team. Just 1 year prior, Minnesota traded Zach LaVine and the draft rights to Lauri Markkanen to acquire Jimmy Butler. With the promising young pieces that they already had on the roster, they tried to make a win-now move in order to set themselves up to be contenders in the West. And they honestly were knocking on that door before Butler got injured mid-season. But after that, the Timberwolves could never get back on the same page with their new star, and everything kind of fell apart. So they basically got rid of two great young players who could have continued to grow and develop in Minnesota for 74 games of Jimmy Butler and an 8-seed playoff berth. Once he left, they were without the young assets that they gave up for him, and were right back to where they were before Butler came. As for Philly, they made this move with the expectation that they could pair Butler next to Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid to form a long-term trio that would compete for championships each year. After losing a heartbreaking 7-game second-round series to the eventual champions, Jimmy decided to leave in free agency and go to the Miami Heat, as he was not a fan of Brett Brown's coaching style. On top of that, Tobias Harris was a free agent as well. The Sixers panicked and didn't want to lose two core pieces in the offseason and gave Harris a 5-year, $180 million deal to retain him. While Tobias is a very good NBA player, he isn't worth anywhere near that amount, which has tied Philly down financially and made him a very difficult contract to move. So in a nutshell, the trade solidified Minnesota's move for Jimmy Butler as a complete failure and left Philly with nothing more than another second-round exit and a bad contract that they're stuck with to this day. And for the 2018 season, it wasn't actually one move, but rather a series of moves that saw a longtime contender desperately try and make a last-minute title run. After Kyrie demanded out during the offseason, the Cavaliers tried to compensate for his loss by adding a bunch of big-name players who were over the hill and not what they used to be. While there was some initial success, the team fell apart by February and was really struggling. As a whole, they looked old, slow, and had awful morale. It was made abundantly clear that they were not going to compete with this roster. So GM Colby Altman blew it all up and tried to retool in order to make one last push for the finals. On the day of the trade deadline, the Cavs traded 6 players and a first-round pick in return for 4 players that they felt could get them back to a one-more rematch with Golden State. They sent Isaiah Thomas, Channing Frye, and a first-round pick to the Lakers and received Jordan Clarkson and Larry Nance. Sent Jay Crowder and Derrick Rose to the Jazz, as well as Amon Shumpert to the Kings in exchange for Rodney Hood and George Hill, and also sent Dwayne Wade back to Miami for just a second-round pick. As you can see, the entire outlook of the roster changed in just a matter of a few hours. Even though they got a bunch of new pieces that were a better fit alongside LeBron, this was just quite simply not a championship caliber roster. Look at some of the lineups that came out of the East before and after this team, and you can see they really had no business competing for a title. But somehow, LeBron found a way to make it work, as he always seemed to do, and went to his 8th straight finals. As for the players that got sent out of Cleveland, Wade had a nice little reunion with Miami before calling it quits. Derrick Rose got waived by the Jazz before ever playing a single game for them, but Jay Crowder carved out a nice spot for himself on Utah, showing his value to playoff teams, and Isaiah Thomas began fading into obscurity with the LA Lakers. So I guess you could say that all of these trades were a mixed bag overall. It succeeded in somehow getting the Cavs back to the finals, which was a stretch goal in itself, and some of the moves worked out for the other teams involved, and some of them didn't. But none of these teams were truly buying and trying to compete. So it wasn't the end of the world when these low leverage moves failed. When zooming out a bit, one thing we can take away from all these trades is that a blockbuster midseason move almost never works out in the short term. If you have immediate championship aspirations, making a drastic change to your roster midway through the season takes time to figure out, and a couple dozen games together before the playoffs quite simply isn't enough time. So if any team makes a big time trade in the next few weeks, I'm just about positive it won't work out. At least not right away. And that's all I have for you guys today. Let me know which trade over the last few years was the most important. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys next time.